On a cold winter morning in Manhattan, the rhythm of Fifth Avenue moves with mechanical certainty. Taxis glide through the canyon of steel and glass. Pedestrians hurry beneath towers of glass that glitter in the sunlight. Luxury boutiques line the sidewalks, their displays illuminated behind polished windows. Few people walking here realize that beneath their feet lies the memory of something that once defined American wealth itself. At the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street once stood a palace. Not a metaphorical palace, nor simply an extravagant residence, but a structure so immense, so richly ornamented, and so unapologetically grand that many who first saw it believed it belonged in Europe rather than New York City. Its vast stone facade rose above the avenue with the solemn authority of a French chateau. Turrets climbed toward the sky. Sculpted figures watched silently from cornices. Bronze gates guarded a world of marble halls, glittering chandeliers, and salons designed to rival the courts of old monarchies. This was the mansion of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. For decades, it stood as the most extravagant private residence in America, a physical symbol of an era that historians would later call the Gilded Age. In a city rapidly transforming into the economic capital of the modern world, the Vanderbilt Mansion embodied the triumph of industry, the spectacle of wealth, and the ambitions of a family whose fortune had been built on railroads, shipping, and relentless expansion. But today, nothing remains of it. The mansion was demolished in the early 20th century, erased from the city with astonishing speed. Its stone walls dismantled, its opulent interiors stripped apart, its grounds absorbed into the relentless commercial machinery of Manhattan. In its place now stand a modern office building. Millions pass it every year without knowing what once dominated this corner of the city. The disappearance of the Vanderbilt Mansion is not merely the story of a building lost to time. It is the story of an entire world that vanished almost overnight. A world of unimaginable wealth, fierce social competition, and architectural grandeur built to proclaim the power of America's new industrial elite. To understand how such a palace could appear, flourish, and then vanish within a single generation, we must return to the final decades of the 19th century, when New York City stood on the threshold of extraordinary transformation. The period following the American Civil War was one of immense growth. Railroads stretched across the continent. Factories expanded. Cities swelled with immigrants seeking opportunity in the expanding industrial economy. Wealth accumulated at unprecedented speed. At the center of this transformation stood a small number of men who would become known as the titans of American capitalism. Among them were figures like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. But long before their empires fully emerged, one family had already begun to dominate the economic landscape: the Vanderbilts. The fortune began with Cornelius Vanderbilt, known throughout his lifetime simply as the Commodore. Born in 1794 on Staten Island, he began his career operating small ferry boats in New York Harbor. Through relentless ambition and shrewd business instincts, he expanded into steamship lines and eventually railroads, building one of the largest transportation empires in the United States. By the time of his death in 1877, Vanderbilt had become one of the richest men in American history. Yet wealth alone did not guarantee social acceptance. The old elite of New York society, families whose fortunes dated back generations, viewed the new industrial millionaires with suspicion. Money could buy property, but it could not instantly purchase prestige. Cornelius Vanderbilt's descendants understood this deeply. To secure their place in the upper ranks of society, they turned not only to business but to architecture. Magnificent homes began to rise along Fifth Avenue. In the late 19th century, Fifth Avenue was transforming into the most prestigious residential boulevard in America. Mansions appeared one after another, each larger and more elaborate than the last. Stone palaces inspired by European castles, Renaissance villas, and French royal residences lined the avenue like monuments to ambition. Among them, none would surpass the vision of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. Born in 1843, Cornelius Vanderbilt II inherited not only vast wealth, but also a deep understanding of the social competition that defined the Gilded Age. As the chairman of the New York Central Railroad, he controlled a powerful transportation network that linked cities across the northeastern United States. His fortune allowed him to imagine a residence unlike anything the city had ever seen. In 1878, he commissioned architects George B. Post and Richard Morris Hunt to design what would become the largest private home in New York City. Hunt, one of the most celebrated architects in America, had studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. His designs drew heavily from the grand traditions of European aristocratic architecture. What he envisioned for Vanderbilt was not simply a mansion. It was a palace intended to rival the great residences of Europe. Construction began in the late 1870s on a massive plot stretching along Fifth Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets. The scale of the project was astonishing. Workers labored for years shaping stone, carving sculptures, and assembling interiors filled with imported materials from across the world. When it was completed in 1882, the Vanderbilt Mansion stood as the ultimate expression of Gilded Age wealth. Its facade extended nearly 150 feet along Fifth Avenue. Towers and steep roofs rose dramatically above the surrounding neighborhood. Ornamental iron gates opened into a private courtyard where carriages arrived beneath the watchful gaze of sculpted lions. Inside, the mansion contained nearly 130 rooms. There were vast reception halls lined with marble columns, grand staircases carved from solid stone, ballrooms illuminated by enormous crystal chandeliers, libraries filled with rare books, dining rooms capable of hosting elaborate dinners attended by New York's most powerful figures. Every room reflected the artistic tastes of European royalty. French tapestries covered the walls. Hand-painted ceilings depicted classical, mythological scenes. Elaborate wood paneling was carved by master craftsmen brought from Europe specifically for the project. The Vanderbilt Mansion was not merely a home. It was a declaration that the new American aristocracy had arrived, and that their wealth could rival the old dynasties of Europe. For several decades, the palace on Fifth Avenue would stand at the center of New York's social universe. But the world that created it was far more fragile than anyone inside its marble halls could have imagined. By the early 1880s, Fifth Avenue had become the ceremonial stage upon which America's wealthiest families displayed their power. The avenue, stretching northward from Washington Square toward Central Park, was gradually transforming from a quiet residential street into a glittering corridor of aristocratic ambition. The Vanderbilt Mansion stood near the northern edge of this elite district, positioned strategically where Fifth Avenue met 57th Street. At the time, this intersection marked the boundary between the established social world of old New York and the rapidly expanding neighborhoods developing farther uptown. Cornelius Vanderbilt II intended his residence to dominate this landscape. From the moment it opened in 1882, the mansion commanded attention. Its architecture, inspired by the French Renaissance style of the Château de Blois, made it one of the most visually dramatic buildings in the city. Unlike the brownstone townhouses that filled much of Manhattan, the Vanderbilt residence rose from the street in pale limestone, richly ornamented with carvings, arches, and sculptural figures. Its towers pierced the skyline at a time when few buildings rose higher than 4 or 5 stories. Newspapers of the era frequently described it as a palace. Visitors arriving at its gates often paused in awe before entering its courtyard. For many Americans, accustomed to the modest homes of earlier generations, the scale of the mansion seemed almost unimaginable. But beyond its physical grandeur, the mansion served a deeper purpose. It was designed to cement the Vanderbilt family's position at the very top of New York society. The Gilded Age was not only an era of wealth, it was also an era of fierce social competition. The families who had accumulated vast fortunes during the industrial boom now competed for recognition within a rigid social hierarchy governed by elaborate customs and expectations. At the center of this social world stood Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, widely known as Mrs. Astor. She presided over what was often referred to as the 400, a carefully curated list of the city's most socially acceptable families. Invitations to her gatherings determined who belonged within the highest circle of New York society and who remained outside its gates. The Vanderbilts, despite their immense wealth, had initially been excluded from this elite circle. Their fortune, built rapidly through commerce and railroads, lacked the generational pedigree that defined older families. But through strategic marriages, philanthropy, and increasingly grand displays of wealth, they gradually secured their place among the city's social elite. The Vanderbilt Mansion became one of the most important settings for this transformation. Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his wife, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, were determined to host events that would rival the most prestigious gatherings in New York. Their residence was designed not only for private living, but also for elaborate social occasions that could accommodate hundreds of guests. The mansion's grand ballroom quickly became one of the most celebrated spaces in the city. Its ceiling soared high above polished floors, illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. Walls were decorated with intricate carvings and gilded moldings. During large gatherings, musicians performed from elevated galleries while guests moved gracefully across the floor in formal attire. Balls hosted by the Vanderbilts were legendary. Carriages lined the avenue outside the mansion for hours as guests arrived in evening gowns and tailcoats. Footmen opened carriage doors beneath glowing lanterns while crowds gathered along the sidewalks to witness the spectacle. Inside, the rooms shimmered with candlelight reflected from mirrors and polished marble. These gatherings were not merely celebrations. They were carefully orchestrated displays of social power. Every detail, from the guest list to the floor arrangements, was designed to reinforce the family's position at the pinnacle of American society. Invitations were highly coveted, and attendance signaled acceptance into the rarefied world of New York's elite. The mansion itself played a central role in this performance of status. Guests entering the residence first passed through a vast reception hall lined with marble columns and intricate stone carvings. From there, a monumental staircase ascended toward the upper levels, its balustrades adorned with sculpted figures and decorative metalwork. Each room offered a new display of artistic craftsmanship. The dining room featured richly carved oak paneling and a massive table capable of seating dozens of guests. The library contained rare volumes collected from across Europe. Private sitting rooms were decorated with silk wall coverings, elaborate fireplaces, and ornate furniture crafted by master artisans. Even the smallest architectural details reflected extraordinary expense. Stained glass windows cast colored light across polished floors. Hand-painted murals decorated ceilings. Fireplaces were carved from rare marbles imported from Italy and France. Servants moved silently through hidden corridors designed specifically to ensure that the household functioned smoothly without interrupting the elegant atmosphere experienced by guests. The mansion required an entire staff to maintain its daily operations. Dozens of servants worked behind the scenes: cooks, maids, footmen, chauffeurs, and gardeners, all ensuring that the household ran with the precision expected in a residence of such scale. At its height, the Vanderbilt Mansion represented more than personal luxury. It symbolized the arrival of an American aristocracy built not on inherited titles, but on industrial power and financial dominance. Yet the world surrounding the mansion was changing rapidly. Outside its gates, New York City was expanding at astonishing speed. Immigration surged as millions arrived from Europe seeking work and opportunity. Factories multiplied. Tenement buildings rose in crowded neighborhoods across Manhattan and Brooklyn. While the Vanderbilts entertained guests beneath glittering chandeliers, thousands of laborers worked long hours in factories and rail yards that fueled the fortunes of industrial magnates. The contrast between these worlds grew increasingly stark. Critics began to question the extraordinary concentration of wealth in the hands of a few powerful families. Newspapers published exposes detailing the harsh conditions faced by workers in factories and railroads owned by the same men who built vast mansions along Fifth Avenue. Yet during the 1880s and early 1890s, the glamour of the Gilded Age still dominated public imagination. The Vanderbilt Mansion remained a focal point of this glittering world. For nearly 2 decades, its halls hosted some of the most extravagant social events in American history. Presidents, financiers, foreign diplomats, and socialites passed through its doors. But beneath the surface of wealth and celebration, the foundations of this world were beginning to shift. For the palace on Fifth Avenue, the first sign of vulnerability would come not from economic forces or social criticism, but from disaster itself. And when it arrived, it would shake the mansion's glittering world to its core. By the final decade of the 19th century, the mansion of Cornelius Vanderbilt II stood at the very center of New York's most powerful social and financial world. Fifth Avenue, once lined with quiet homes and shaded gardens, had transformed into a grand corridor of wealth where the city's most influential families constructed residences that rivaled the palaces of Europe. Yet even among these extraordinary homes, the Vanderbilt Mansion remained unmatched. Its towers and steep slate roofs dominated the intersection of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. Visitors approaching from Central Park could see its silhouette rising above the surrounding rooftops, a vast limestone chateau whose ornate facade seemed almost theatrical in its grandeur. It was not simply the size of the mansion that captured attention. It was the atmosphere that surrounded it. Carriages rolled through its iron gates daily. Uniformed footmen waited along the steps to greet arriving guests. Inside, the soft glow of chandeliers reflected off marble floors and gilded walls. The mansion functioned as both private residence and social stage, a place where the rituals of the Gilded Age unfolded with elaborate precision. Cornelius Vanderbilt II himself was not merely a social figure. He was one of the most powerful industrialists in America. As chairman of the New York Central Railroad, he presided over one of the most important transportation networks in the nation. The rail lines under his influence stretched across vast distances, connecting New York with Chicago and the rapidly growing cities of the Midwest. Railroads were the arteries of American commerce during this period. They carried raw materials from mines and forests, transported manufactured goods across the continent, and linked distant markets into a single national economy. Control over these networks brought immense wealth. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilt family fortune had reached staggering levels. Their investments extended beyond railroads into shipping, real estate, and finance. They possessed the resources to shape industries, influence politics, and leave a visible mark on the architectural landscape of the country. The mansion on Fifth Avenue served as the symbolic center of this power. Within its walls, some of the most important business and social relationships of the era quietly developed. Financiers, railroad executives, diplomats, and politicians gathered in its drawing rooms for private conversations that often carried enormous economic consequences. The house itself was designed to accommodate this world of influence. Its vast reception rooms allowed for formal gatherings attended by hundreds of guests. Yet it also contained smaller private salons where confidential discussions could unfold away from the public eye. The library, lined with dark wood paneling and towering bookshelves, became a favored setting for intimate meetings. The room's heavy draperies and richly carved furniture created an atmosphere of quiet authority, a place where decisions affecting millions of people could be discussed over brandy and cigars. Beyond business, however, the mansion reached its greatest prominence during the glittering social season of New York. Each winter, the city's elite families returned from their summer estates in Newport, the Hudson Valley, and the countryside of Europe. The cold months became a continuous cycle of formal dinners, opera performances, charity events, and grand balls. The Vanderbilt Mansion hosted many of the most celebrated gatherings of this season. Preparations for these events began days in advance. Servants polished silver, arranged elaborate floral displays, and prepared vast quantities of food in the mansion's extensive kitchens. Musicians were hired, invitations carefully distributed, and seating arrangements meticulously planned to maintain the delicate balance of social hierarchy. On the evening of grand reception, Fifth Avenue itself became a spectacle. Rows of carriages lined the street beneath flickering gas lamps. Drivers waited patiently while guests ascended the mansion's steps. Women dressed in silk gowns and elaborate jewelry passed through the towering doors, escorted by gentlemen in formal evening attire. Inside, the mansion shimmered with light. The grand staircase served as a ceremonial entrance to the upper floors, allowing guests to make a dramatic appearance before descending into the ballroom. Conversations filled the air as musicians performed elegant waltzes and orchestral arrangements from elevated galleries. Champagne flowed freely. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. For many guests, attending a Vanderbilt gathering represented the pinnacle of social recognition. To be seen within the mansion's glittering halls was to confirm one's place among the most powerful figures in American society. Yet this world of privilege extended beyond entertainment. The Vanderbilt family also used their wealth to support cultural and philanthropic institutions that would shape the city for generations. Cornelius Vanderbilt II became deeply involved in the development of organizations such as the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Yacht Club. His contributions helped establish New York as a major center of cultural life, comparable to the great capitals of Europe. Philanthropy, however, served multiple purposes during the Gilded Age. It allowed industrial magnates to demonstrate civic responsibility while also reinforcing their social standing. Donations to museums, universities, and charities were often accompanied by public recognition that further elevated the reputation of wealthy families. Within the Vanderbilt Mansion, these charitable initiatives were frequently discussed during private dinners and planning meetings. But while the mansion symbolized the triumph of American wealth, it also reflected the tensions of a society undergoing rapid transformation. The 1890s were a time of profound economic change. Industrial expansion continued at a breathtaking pace, yet the benefits of that growth were distributed unevenly. In crowded tenements across the city, immigrant families struggled to survive on low wages. Labor strikes erupted in factories and rail yards as workers demanded safer conditions and fairer pay. Railroads themselves, the very foundation of the Vanderbilt fortune, became battlegrounds between corporate power and organized labor. Events such as the Pullman strike of 1894 revealed the growing anger among workers who believed the new industrial elite had amassed wealth at the expense of ordinary Americans. Although Cornelius Vanderbilt II rarely appeared in the public spotlight during these controversies, the immense fortune he controlled inevitably tied his name to the broader debates surrounding wealth and power. Yet within the walls of the mansion, life continued with remarkable stability. Season after season, guests returned to its halls. Business negotiations unfolded quietly in its libraries and salons. Lavish dinners and elegant balls reinforced the rituals of a social order that appeared, at least from the outside, unshakable. But history often moves with sudden and unexpected force. In the spring of 1895, disaster struck the Vanderbilt Mansion in a way no one could have predicted. The event would temporarily silence the music of its ballroom, darken its brilliant halls, and reveal how fragile even the grandest symbols of wealth could be. For the palace on Fifth Avenue, the moment of triumph had already passed. The era that built it had reached its peak, and soon, the slow unraveling of that world would begin. For more than a decade after its completion, the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue had seemed almost permanent, a monument of stone and wealth rising confidently above the city's expanding streets. Its towering roofs, carved facades, and glittering interiors embodied the triumph of an age in which industry, finance, and ambition appeared capable of reshaping the world itself. Yet history rarely allows such symbols of power to remain untouched. In the early morning hours of March 27, 1895, a quiet but devastating catastrophe began to unfold inside the Great House. It was still dark outside when smoke was first noticed rising from within the mansion. Somewhere deep within the building, fire had taken hold. The exact cause was never completely certain, but it likely began in one of the electrical systems or heating areas hidden within the structure's complex network of rooms and corridors. What began as a small flame quickly grew into something far more dangerous. The Vanderbilt Mansion was vast, a labyrinth of chambers, staircases, galleries, and decorative wooden interiors that, despite the stone exterior, contained many materials capable of feeding a fire. Rich paneling, elaborate furniture, tapestries, and carpets all provided fuel for the growing blaze. Servants were among the first to realize what was happening. As smoke began creeping through the hallways, alarms were raised, and the household staff rushed to alert the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, his wife Alice, and other members of the household were quickly evacuated from their rooms as the danger spread. Within minutes, flames had begun moving through sections of the interior. The fire department was summoned, and engines soon arrived on Fifth Avenue. In the cold, early hours of the morning, firefighters raced to contain the blaze before it could consume one of the most famous homes in America. The scene outside the mansion quickly drew crowds. Even before sunrise, curious onlookers gathered along the avenue, as smoke poured from the windows and roof. The great limestone palace, so often associated with elegance and celebration, now stood surrounded by hoses, ladders, and frantic efforts to prevent disaster. Inside, the damage grew severe. Flames swept through several of the mansion's most magnificent rooms. Ornate ceilings blackened, wood paneling cracked and burned. Precious artworks, furniture, and decorative elements that had been imported from Europe were destroyed in minutes. Firefighters struggled to reach every part of the building. The mansion's enormous size and intricate design made it difficult to navigate quickly, and flames spread through hidden passages and ventilation spaces. By the time the fire was finally brought under control, large sections of the interior had been devastated. Miraculously, no lives were lost, but the physical damage was extensive. Newspapers the following day reported that some of the mansion's most celebrated rooms, including portions of its grand reception areas, had suffered heavy destruction. For New Yorkers, the event carried symbolic weight. The Vanderbilt Mansion had long stood as one of the most visible representations of the Gilded Age. To see smoke rising from its towers created a powerful image, one that seemed to suggest that even the grandest achievements of wealth and architecture were not immune to sudden misfortune. Yet the response of Cornelius Vanderbilt II reflected the resilience and determination that had defined his family's rise. Rather than abandon the damaged palace, Vanderbilt ordered it rebuilt, and not merely repaired. He insisted that the mansion be restored to an even greater level of magnificence than before. Architect Richard Morris Hunt was once again involved in overseeing the restoration. Craftsmen returned to rebuild the damaged interiors with extraordinary attention to detail. Marble surfaces were replaced, new paneling installed, and decorative elements recreated by artisans capable of matching the original designs. The reconstruction became an enormous undertaking. Workers labored for months, restoring the mansion's grandeur. Rare materials were once again imported from Europe. Sculptors and painters recreated ceilings and wall decorations that had been lost in the flames. By the time the work was completed, the mansion had regained its place as the most extravagant residence in New York. Some observers even claimed that the restored interiors surpassed the originals in beauty. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the fire had merely been a temporary interruption in the mansion's long life. But beneath the surface of this recovery, deeper forces were already reshaping the city around it. The 1890s marked a turning point in New York's development. The city was expanding at a pace that few could have predicted. Population growth accelerated as immigrants arrived from across Europe and beyond. Businesses multiplied. Commercial activity intensified along the very streets that had once been dominated by private residences. Fifth Avenue itself was beginning to change. While it remained the most prestigious address in the city, new pressures were emerging. Department stores, luxury retailers, and office buildings were gradually pushing northward, transforming sections of the avenue into commercial districts. Land values began rising dramatically. The vast plots occupied by the great mansions became increasingly attractive to developers who recognized the enormous profits that could be generated by replacing single-family residences with commercial structures. Some of New York's wealthiest families had already begun moving farther uptown, toward quieter neighborhoods bordering Central Park. Others established seasonal homes outside the city, particularly in Newport, Rhode Island, where vast summer cottages, themselves grander than many palaces, became the new stage for elite society. The social center of American wealth was slowly shifting. Although the Vanderbilt Mansion remained magnificent, its surroundings were no longer quite the same as when it had first been built. The quiet elegance of Fifth Avenue was gradually giving way to the restless energy of a modern commercial metropolis. Cornelius Vanderbilt II himself would not live long enough to witness the full transformation. In September 1899, only a few years after the fire and restoration, he died suddenly at the age of 56. His death marked the end of an era. The man who had commissioned the greatest private residence in New York was gone, and the world he had helped shape was already beginning to fade. Within a few years, the mansion that once symbolized the absolute peak of American wealth would face a challenge far greater than fire. It would face the unstoppable force of a changing city, a city that no longer had room for palaces built for a different age. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in September of 1899, the immense mansion at 5th Avenue and 57th Street lost the figure whose ambition had given it purpose. For nearly 2 decades, he had presided over the house as both patriarch and host, guiding its role at the center of New York's most powerful social circle. Without him, the palace remained physically intact, but its meaning began to shift. The estate passed to his widow, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt. Alice was a woman of refinement, intelligence, and considerable strength. During her husband's lifetime, she had played a central role in managing the household and maintaining the family social presence. Yet the world she inherited at the turn of the 20th century was changing far faster than anyone inside the mansion could fully control. By 1900, New York City had entered a new era. Electric streetlights illuminated the avenues at night. Elevated railways thundered above crowded streets. Businesses expanded rapidly, and the financial power of the city was becoming truly global. Manhattan was no longer merely a wealthy American city. It was evolving into one of the most important commercial capitals on Earth. With this transformation came a fundamental change in how land was valued. The enormous estates that lined 5th Avenue during the Gilded Age had once been symbols of prestige. Their owners valued privacy, space, and architectural grandeur. But as the city's population and economic activity intensified, the land beneath those mansions became extraordinarily valuable for a different reason: commerce. Developers and investors began to look at 5th Avenue not as a residential boulevard, but as the perfect location for department stores, office buildings, and luxury retail establishments. The wide avenue, the growing flow of wealthy shoppers, and the proximity to Central Park made it ideal for businesses eager to attract the city's elite clientele. Gradually, the transformation began. Shops appeared where mansions once stood. Elegant storefronts replaced private gardens. Crowds filled the sidewalks where carriages had once waited quietly outside aristocratic homes. This change did not happen overnight, but its momentum was unmistakable. Some families resisted at first, determined to preserve the residential character of 5th Avenue. Others quietly relocated farther north or shifted their social lives to seasonal estates in Newport, Long Island, or the Hudson Valley. Even the Vanderbilts themselves had multiple residences outside Manhattan, including vast country estates and the famous Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II's cousin George Washington Vanderbilt. For Alice Vanderbilt, the mansion on 5th Avenue remained both home and symbol. Yet maintaining such a residence required extraordinary resources. The building itself was immense, with nearly 130 rooms. A large staff was necessary simply to keep it functioning. Heating, lighting, repairs, and constant upkeep demanded continuous attention. At the same time, the world outside the mansion was becoming louder, busier, and increasingly commercial. The quiet elegance that once surrounded the residence was disappearing. Luxury retailers began expanding along 5th Avenue. Large department stores drew thousands of shoppers every day. Traffic intensified as streetcars, carriages, and eventually automobiles crowded the avenue. The palace that had once stood at the center of elite society was gradually becoming an island surrounded by commercial energy. For many observers, the shift symbolized a broader transformation in American culture. The Gilded Age had been defined by spectacular displays of wealth through private architecture. Magnificent homes served as monuments to personal fortune. But the new century brought different priorities. Corporations grew larger. Commercial real estate became more profitable than private estates. Skyscrapers began rising across Manhattan, their steel frames reaching higher into the sky than any mansion tower could hope to match. The city was moving upward and forward. By the early 1920s, the pressure on 5th Avenue had become impossible to ignore. Developers recognized that the land occupied by the Vanderbilt Mansion was among the most valuable parcels in New York. Its location at the intersection of 5th Avenue and 57th Street placed it directly within the city's expanding luxury shopping district. Offers began to appear. Real estate investors understood that replacing a single private residence with a commercial building could generate enormous profits. Retail stores, offices, and modern commercial spaces would attract a constant flow of business far beyond anything a private home could justify. For Alice Vanderbilt, the decision was deeply personal. The mansion was not merely property. It was the place where she had lived with her husband, hosted countless gatherings, and watched the unfolding of one of America's most extraordinary eras. Every room carried memories. The grand ballroom where music had once echoed during lavish receptions. The marble staircases where guests in glittering attire had descended beneath brilliant chandeliers. The quiet library where conversations about business and politics had shaped the direction of powerful industries. To destroy such a place seemed almost unimaginable. Yet the economic realities of the modern city were relentless. Maintaining the mansion had become increasingly difficult, while the value of the land beneath it continued to rise to extraordinary levels. Eventually, the pressure became too great. In 1926, Alice Vanderbilt made the decision that would forever change the landscape of Fifth Avenue. She sold the mansion. The buyers were real estate developers who intended to replace the great residence with a commercial building suited to the rapidly changing city. For many New Yorkers, the news came as a shock. The Vanderbilt Mansion had stood for more than 40 years as one of the most recognizable buildings in Manhattan. Its towers and ornate facade were familiar landmarks to anyone traveling along Fifth Avenue. Now it faced destruction. Within months of the sale, preparations for demolition began. Workers arrived with scaffolding, tools, and equipment. The gates that had once opened for elegant carriages now admitted crews tasked with dismantling one of the grandest private homes ever built in America. Stone by stone, the palace would soon disappear, and with it, an entire chapter of New York's Gilded Age would fade into memory. In the spring of 1926, the great Vanderbilt Mansion entered its final chapter. For more than 4 decades, the limestone palace had stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street as one of the most powerful symbols of the Gilded Age. Its towers had watched over a city transforming from a 19th century port into a modern metropolis. Its grand halls had hosted some of the most influential figures of American finance, politics, and society. Now, the process of dismantling it had begun. Demolition in Manhattan, during the early 20th century, was both methodical and strangely theatrical. The destruction of such a massive structure could not occur quickly. Instead, workers carefully stripped the building piece by piece, removing valuable materials before bringing down the stone walls that had once defined its imposing exterior. First came the interiors. Teams of laborers moved through the mansion's rooms, dismantling fixtures, removing decorative elements, and salvaging anything that might still hold value. Chandeliers were lowered from ceilings that had once glittered with candlelight. Marble fireplaces were extracted from their elaborate settings. Ornate wooden paneling was carefully pried from walls that had once framed some of the most elegant gatherings in the city. Furniture and artworks that remained in the house were removed or sold. The rooms that had once dazzled visitors with their grandeur gradually became hollow shells. Dust gathered where polished floors had once reflected the glow of chandeliers. Echoes replaced the music and conversation that had once filled the halls. Outside, Fifth Avenue continued its relentless movement. Automobiles now dominated the streets where horse-drawn carriages had once lined up for social events. Department stores and luxury retailers drew crowds of shoppers from across the city. The energy of commerce pulsed through the district day and night. Few places illustrated the transformation of New York more clearly than this intersection. Where aristocratic families had once built palaces, modern business now demanded space. As demolition progressed, the mansion's exterior gradually began to change. Workers erected scaffolding around the towering structure. Sections of roof were removed. Decorative sculptures that had watched silently over the avenue for decades were taken down. The palace that had once seemed indestructible now revealed its vulnerability. Stone blocks were lowered carefully to the ground. Carved ornaments disappeared from the facade. Windows that had once illuminated lavish interiors were shattered or removed. Crowds often gathered along Fifth Avenue to watch. For many New Yorkers, the demolition carried a strange, emotional weight. Even those who had never entered the mansion recognized it as a symbol of an earlier age, a time when immense private wealth expressed itself through architecture rather than corporate skyscrapers. Some observers watched with fascination, curious to witness the disappearance of such a famous landmark. Others felt a quiet sense of loss. Newspaper columns occasionally reflected on the passing of the Gilded Age mansions that had once lined the avenue. One by one, these grand homes were vanishing, replaced by modern structures designed for commerce rather than private life. The Vanderbilt Mansion was among the largest and most dramatic of them all. Its demolition became a visual representation of a larger shift occurring throughout the city. As the workers continued their task, the building slowly lost its identity. Without its towers and carved facades, it began to resemble little more than a skeleton of stone and brick. The elegant courtyard where carriages once arrived was filled with debris and construction equipment. Even the grand staircase, once one of the most admired architectural features of the mansion, was eventually dismantled. Stone steps that had carried generations of guests upward toward glittering ballrooms were removed piece by piece. Decorative railings disappeared. Sculpted figures that once adorned the balustrades were carefully taken away. Inside the structure, the destruction continued floor by floor. Walls were knocked down. Ceilings collapsed. The intricate layout of salons, galleries, and corridors that had once formed the heart of the residence was gradually erased. Months passed as the demolition moved forward. By late 1926, only fragments of the mansion remained standing. What had once been the largest private home in New York City had been reduced to piles of stone and timber. The towers that once dominated the skyline of Fifth Avenue were gone. The palace that had symbolized the ambition of America's new industrial aristocracy existed now only in photographs, drawings, and fading memories. In its place, developers began preparing the site for a new structure. The building that would rise there would reflect the priorities of the modern city: efficiency, commercial opportunity, and architectural styles suited to a new era of urban life. Where Vanderbilt's palace had once stood, a large commercial building known as the Bergdorf Goodman Building would eventually emerge, housing luxury retail spaces and offices designed to attract the growing wealth of 20th century New York. The transformation was complete. The age of private palaces along Fifth Avenue had ended. What remained was a city moving forward with extraordinary speed, driven by business, technology, and the demands of a population that continued to grow larger with each passing decade. Yet for those who remembered the Vanderbilt Mansion, its disappearance left behind a lingering question. How could a structure so grand, so expensive, and so central to the identity of its era vanish so completely within a single generation? The answer lay not only in real estate economics or urban development. It lay in the deeper truth about cities themselves. New York had never been a place that preserved the past easily. It was a city defined by reinvention, a place where ambition constantly pushed aside what came before in order to build something new. And in that relentless forward motion, even the greatest palaces could disappear. Today, at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, there is no trace of the palace that once stood there. Where the towering limestone mansion of Cornelius Vanderbilt II once commanded the avenue, sleek storefronts and modern facades now dominate the landscape. Luxury boutiques illuminate the sidewalks with bright displays. Office workers move in steady streams through revolving doors. Tourists pause to photograph the glittering windows of one of New York's most famous shopping districts. The city continues its rhythm without interruption. Few who pass through this intersection realize that beneath the pavement and foundations of the modern buildings lies the memory of one of the most extraordinary private homes ever constructed in America. Yet the story of the Vanderbilt Mansion has not completely vanished. Old photographs still capture its dramatic silhouette. The steep roofs, the towering turrets, the elaborate carvings that once gave Fifth Avenue the appearance of a European royal boulevard. In sepia-toned images preserved in archives and historical collections, the mansion stands frozen in time, its massive gates open to admit the elegant carriages of another era. Through these images, historians and architectural scholars have reconstructed what the palace once represented. It was not simply a residence. It was a statement about power, ambition, and the identity of a nation that was rapidly transforming itself in the late 19th century. The Gilded Age was a period of extraordinary contrasts. On one hand, it produced immense wealth and industrial progress that reshaped the American economy. Railroads connected distant regions. Factories produced goods at unprecedented scales. Cities expanded with remarkable speed, but this growth also created deep divisions. While families like the Vanderbilts built palaces of stone and marble, millions of workers lived in crowded tenements, struggling to survive in a rapidly industrializing society. The wealth displayed along Fifth Avenue stood in stark contrast to the realities of urban poverty only a few streets away. The mansion of Cornelius Vanderbilt II became one of the most visible symbols of this divide. Its vast scale, its imported materials, and its extraordinary luxury reflected the concentration of wealth that defined the Gilded Age. For some observers, the mansion represented the success of American industry and the possibilities of ambition in a rapidly growing nation. For others, it symbolized excess. Yet history rarely judges such monuments in simple terms. The Vanderbilt Mansion was both product and reflection of its time. It emerged during a moment when private fortunes had reached unprecedented levels and when wealthy families sought to express their status through architecture that rivaled the palaces of Europe. In doing so, they transformed the physical landscape of American cities. Across the country, grand estates appeared during this period. From Newport's vast seaside cottages to sprawling country houses in the Hudson Valley and beyond, these buildings were designed not only as homes, but also as symbols of cultural aspiration. Many of the architects who designed them had studied in Europe, bringing with them ideas drawn from the traditions of Renaissance palaces, French chateaux, and English country houses. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of the Vanderbilt Mansion, was among the most influential of these figures. His work helped introduce the Beaux-Arts style to the United States and shaped the architectural ambitions of America's wealthiest families. Although the Fifth Avenue mansion itself is gone, Hunt's influence remains visible in many surviving buildings throughout the country. The disappearance of the Vanderbilt Palace also reveals something deeper about the nature of New York City. Unlike many European capitals, where centuries-old structures are preserved as cultural treasures, New York has always been defined by its willingness to rebuild itself again and again. Entire neighborhoods have been demolished and replaced as the city evolves. Streets once filled with warehouses become residential districts. Industrial zones transform into parks and cultural centers. Towers rise where modest homes once stood. The city's identity is rooted not in preservation alone, but in constant reinvention. In this environment, even the grandest buildings can vanish within a generation if economic forces demand change. The Vanderbilt Mansion stood for only 44 years. In architectural terms, that is an extraordinarily brief life for such a monumental structure. Yet during those decades, it played a central role in the social and cultural life of one of the most important cities in the world. Within its walls, the rituals of the Gilded Age unfolded. Elaborate balls, political conversations, and quiet negotiations among the men who controlled vast industries. The palace served as a stage upon which the ambitions of a new American aristocracy were displayed. And then, as the 20th century arrived, the world that had created it began to disappear. Industrial fortunes evolved into corporate empires. Social rituals shifted. Commercial development reshaped the city's most valuable land. The mansion that once symbolized ultimate wealth became economically impractical, and so vanished. Today, historians often refer to the Vanderbilt Mansion as one of the most spectacular lost buildings in New York's history. Architectural drawings, photographs, and written descriptions allow scholars to reconstruct its appearance with remarkable detail. But no photograph can fully capture the experience of standing before it. The sense of scale, the intricacy of its carvings, the quiet authority of a building designed to announce the arrival of a powerful family in the center of a rapidly changing nation. In the end, the mansion's disappearance tells a story that extends far beyond a single building. It tells the story of the Gilded Age itself, an era of breathtaking wealth and ambition that rose quickly, reshaped the American landscape, and then gave way to a different kind of modern world. The palace on Fifth Avenue may be gone, but its story remains woven into the history of New York, a reminder that even the grandest symbols of power can fade, leaving behind only echoes in stone, photographs, and memory.